next chapter is called Sagas and Swords. And before we get to that, I'd like to just go over a little bit of the vocabulary. The word flexibility, which is the capability of bending without breaking. You can talk about the flexibility of a stick, or you can talk about people being flexible as well, not necessarily their bodies, but their thinking and their ideas. You can bend your ideas and not break them. You can change a little bit, being flexible. Intently, which means closely and carefully. Excuse me. A saga. It's a noun. It's a long story, and it tells of historic or legendary events, a saga. Weld is to make two pieces of metal into one by heating them to high temperatures. So those are some vocabulary that you'll be hearing later on in our story. But where have we already been? The last time we learned about some of the daily life of Bjorn and Tolly and their families. What were some of the daily chores that Bjorn and Tolly had to do at home? What about Kitta and the other women? What is Bjorn's father's job? Well, he's a blacksmith. Can you explain what a blacksmith does? He works in a forge, works with metal items, providing useful things. So what did Bjorn's father say that they were going to be doing right at the end of the last read aloud? They were going to begin to make Bjorn's sword. That's right. So swords were mainly for the elite, the jarls owned swords. But if they were useful weapons, then why didn't every Nordic man own one? Well, because they were very expensive and not everyone went on raids. What do you think Bjorn's father will do to make a sword? Remember, he's a blacksmith. He works with metals to make useful items. What will that process be like? Might be something to think about as we read. As soon as breakfast was over, Tolly set off to his uncle's farm. After my grandmother and Kitta had cleared and washed the bowls and cups, they went to the back room with my mother and aunt. There, they were busily sewing several new tunics. Kitta had told me that one was for me and one was for Tolly. They were going away presents. Meanwhile, my grandfather and brothers prepared to go hunting and fishing, and I went to the forge with my father and uncle. As usual, I began my working day in the forge by adding wood to the fire, and then used the bellows to fuel the flames. Today was no ordinary day, though. After today, I would own my very own sword. It is not usual for a boy like me to own a sword. Although my father was a carl, able to own land and a business, or to fight and trade, he was not a jarl, a member of the elite nobility. Swords such as the one my father was about to make for me were usually reserved for the jarls. I had seen such swords carried by nobles as they arrived in our town to participate in a thing, our local assembly. We think of a thing as a general thing. This is a thing with a capital T, T-H-I-N-G, capital T. It's a local assembly. The thing was held outdoors once a year, and it was a time for carls, such as my father and uncles, to sit together with jarls to discuss issues, settle disputes, judge crimes, and make decisions about our community. Even though the Karls were a larger group, the Jarls had greater authority. It was at one of these assemblies that it had been decided that 25 young men from our town should leave and go to Iceland. When you hear about Karls and Jarls sitting together and Jarls having greater authority but more Karls, what does that remind you of? It reminds me of ancient Rome. Remember the plebeians? The plebeians were a greater number. Most of the people were plebeians. And there were only a few patricians, and yet the patricians had more authority and more power in society. It was at the same meeting that Lord Toki had announced that my father had saved not only his life, but the king's life. My father had uncovered a plot that people were planning to kill both Lord Toki and the king. He had overheard 2 spies talking in his workshop. My father had prevented this terrible crime from happening, and to thank my father, Lord Toki wanted to give me a nobleman's sword. Once the fire in the forge was burning fiercely, my father was ready to begin. He had explained to me many times that maintaining a strong fire in which wood is burning to extreme temperatures was the secret to being a good blacksmith. He told me that the iron is only as good as the flames that shape it. Bjorn, I want you to pay close attention to everything I do. You need to understand that making a strong sword is very difficult. It requires much skill, my father explained. I will, I said earnestly. And so he began. I watched carefully as my father bundled together bars of iron. As I watched, the heat from the flames warmed my skin, turning it pink, and before long I was dripping with sweat. I watched my father as he worked carefully and intently. As the iron bars softened and connected, my father used a variety of tools to draw out the metal into the length of a sword. He worked to weld the pieces of metal together, and as he pulled and stretched the metal, he twisted it. Slowly, the shape of a sword began to appear. Do you see what has happened, Bjorn? He asked, though I could tell that he didn't really expect an answer. The heating and twisting of the different kinds of metal has created a composite of iron that now has the necessary strength and flexibility for a sword blade. Yes, I see, I responded. My father placed the softened metal upon the anvil and continued to twist, hammer, chisel, and file it into shape. As soon as he was satisfied with its shape, I knew he would plunge the hot metal into a tub of cold water to cool and harden it. Once the iron had cooled, he would begin to sharpen the blade. Although I did not yet know how to make a sword, I did know how to make spear points, axes, and nails, as well as knives, pots, and pans. That much I had already learned from my father. Father, I have thought of a name for my sword, I said as I continued to watch him work. I want to name it Foe-biter. The word foe means enemy, and it was common in this time for people to name their swords. My father looked up from his work. That is a fitting name for a warrior's sword, he said seriously. This sword will serve you well. You can think of me and our family when you are called to use it. I stared at the sword for several moments and did not look up. I could feel the sweat and the tears merge into one steady flow of water droplets that fell from my face onto the earthen floor. At that moment, as my father spoke to me, I wanted time to stop. I wanted to stop it completely so that I could stay with him forever. For the rest of the day, my father, my uncle, and I worked together in the workshop, melting, shaping, and cooling iron. From time to time, people stopped by to collect something my father or my uncle had made for them. They were paid in either silver pieces or other goods that my family could use. As the day wore on, my father and uncle began to talk about the evening of storytelling that was scheduled to take place in the main marketplace. This was a common practice before special events such as weddings, festivals, or voyages. Poems of old were told by skalds so that we would know our history. It was considered important that these sagas be handed down through the generations and never forgotten. Our town had two skalds who had committed to memory dozens of sagas of Viking history and adventures. One of the skalds would be traveling on the cargo ship with Tolly and me. He was charged with the responsibility of keeping the sagas alive in our new home. There was also a boy who lived on the same street as Tolly and I, who had been apprenticed to this skald. He had already spent many months with him, learning these poetic tales. He, too, would keep our history alive. So the word saga means to speak or to say, and sagas were long stories that tell of history and legendary events. They're told by people whose job it was to learn, memorize, and retell the sagas. Skalds were those people who learned and memorized these poetic tales. And so, late in the afternoon, after eating a dinner of fish, vegetables, and barley bread, instead of preparing to go to sleep for the night, my family, along with many others, made its way to the marketplace at the center of the town. A large fire had been lit, and many people were already seated around it. The two skalds sat upon a wooden platform beside the fire. Once everyone arrived and was settled, the first skald stood up and began to recite a saga of bravery and adventure. I looked into the eager faces of my family and friends, their eyes lit by the flickering flames of the fire. I knew in my heart that this would be the last time that we would all sit together to listen to these ancient tales. Were your predictions correct about how Bjorn's father made Bjorn's sword? I didn't know much about how a blacksmith works. You heard that today was not an ordinary day for Bjorn. What made today special for him? That's right, by the end of the day, he would own a sword. Was it common for a boy to own a sword? Why not? Well, Bjorn's father was a carl, and only the elite jarls owned sword. Why do you think Bjorn starts to cry when he is helping to make his sword? How do you think he is feeling? Well, Bjorn is unsure that he's quite ready to grow all the way up, and he is sad about leaving his home. What is the name of the Norse people's local assembly? It's called a thing, a capital Thing. And where was the thing held? Outdoors. Why was the thing important to the Norse? Well, it was a time that the carls and the jarls would meet together to discuss issues, settle disputes, judge crimes, and make decisions about the community. And what does this Norse assembly resemble in ancient Roman society? It sounds similar to the Roman Senate in the Forum. What announcement about Bjorn's father was made at the thing? Well, Lord Toki announced that Bjorn's father had uncovered the plot of two spies to kill the king and Lord Toki. He was able to stop the crime from happening. And what was Bjorn's father's reward? Lord Toki requested that Bjorn be given the sword of a jarl or nobleman. Bjorn's father worked intently to make Bjorn's sword. Do you think making a sword is an easy or a challenging task? Well, blacksmiths have to weld together metals to create swords that would have flexibility and strength. I think there was a lot of intent work, challenging work, in order to be able to do that. Why were the skalds important to the Viking Age people? Well, the skalds were poets who reminded the Vikings of their history through the oral retelling of sagas. So at this point, Vikings did not have writing, and so they had to have people who could speak their history in order to remember it. All right, thank you so much.